Happy Monday! Today's Monday, and you know what that means. Welcome to another episode of RUNTALK. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Karp. On today's episode, we're going to talk about something that is a plague to most runners, and injuries. You know, so many runners get injured, and it's unfortunate, and it's surprising because this thing that we evolved to do, all humans evolved to run. If you look back into the research, there's been a lot of interesting research on the evolution of humans as runners, and so it's very fascinating that this thing that we all evolved to do injures a lot of people because that doesn't make any sense. From an evolutionary standpoint, we shouldn't get injured from something that we evolved to do. That's not the way evolution works. And so today's show is going to be all about running injuries and why people get them, what are the factors involved in getting injured, and then all the my secrets on how to prevent running injuries, because there are secrets, and the reason why people get injured is because they don't follow the rules. And so let's get started. We're going to have a good show today, and feel free to ask questions whenever you want. And then this is being recorded, so you can watch it afterwards as a review if you like, or people who can't watch live can watch it later. So let's talk all about running injuries. So the first issue is something I just mentioned. I do want to touch a little bit on the evolution of us as runners, because like I said, this thing that we evolved to do shouldn't be injurious. By itself, running is not injurious. We all evolved to do it. The way evolution works is you have a random mutation of a gene, and if that random mutation confers some kind of advantage to our survival as a species, then that mutation sticks around and is proliferated in future generations. And so the way we became runners is through these random mutations of genes that collectively made us, shaped us the way we are, and enabled us to run. And so running in and of itself is not injurious, because that's not the way evolution works. Evolution doesn't have any foresight. It doesn't. We don't make structures and function because of what will give us future utility. Evolution works by a series of random mutations, and then if those confer an advantage, which running obviously did confer an advantage, then that sticks around for future generations and gets passed on from one generation to the next. And so that's the evolutionary thing. And I urge you to go and look at all the research. There's been plenty of research on how we evolved as humans, the reason why our body is structured the way it is, the arch of our foot, why it looks like a suspension bridge. There's reasons for that. The fact that we sweat, is very important from an evolutionary standpoint. It allows us to run and exercise in very hot environments because it gives us a chance to dissipate heat, which other animals can't do. They can't dissipate heat through sweating, through the evaporation of sweat. So there's many things in evolution that made us the runners that we are, and so I urge you to take a look at the research on that. So as far as injuries can be categorized into two major categories as to why people get injured. We have intrinsic factors that are specific to us, and then we have extrinsic factors specific to the environment. So intrinsic factors are things like bone density, whether you're a new runner, there's a greater chance of getting injured if you're a new runner compared to if you've been running for a while, because running itself has a protective effect on future injuries, because when you run, you strengthen the bones, you strengthen the tendons, the joints, and that helps prevent future injuries. So new runners are at a greater chance of getting injured. And then I mentioned bone density. Bone density has a lot to do with genetics. Some people have denser bones than others. And then that also gets us into another intrinsic factor, which is the sex, male or female. And so women don't necessarily have any greater chance of getting injured compared to men unless they have characteristics of the female athlete triad, which has been given a new name lately. Now it's called Red S, stands for something. But I still call it the female athlete triad, which is a collection of three characteristics. And one of the major characteristics is losing the menstrual cycle. So menstrual dysfunction, whether you have a dysfunctional menstrual cycle that you don't get it regular, don't get your period regularly every month, or if you lose it altogether, and that's called amenorrhea, without menstruation. And so under that condition, because estrogen has such a significant impact on someone's bone health, in fact, it has the greatest impact for women on their bone health. So any condition that lowers estrogen level increases the chance for a stress fracture for females. And so you see this a lot among female runners, especially like at high school and college runners who are running a lot. A lot of the women are losing their menstrual cycle, or at least not getting it regularly. And so they're losing the bone's protective effect of estrogen. And then they end up getting a stress fracture because they keep increasing the volume of work that they're doing. They increase their mileage, and they end up with a stress fracture. So as long as women do not have any of the three characteristics of the female athlete triad, so as long as they're having a normal menstruation every month, disordered eating is another one of the three issues with the female athlete triad. So as long as they're eating a normal, balanced, healthy diet, getting in all the macronutrients and micronutrients that they need, and then osteoporosis, which people think of that as an elderly disease, but it can happen to anybody. And so as long as women do not have any of the three characteristics of the female athlete triad, then they're not at any greater risk of injury compared to a male. So I want to make that clear right from the get-go. But if they do, and again, like I said, the losing the menstrual cycle is pretty common among female runners who run a lot, but it has more to do with the lack of nutrition, the lack of calories, than it has to do with the amount of running that they do. And so the trigger for losing the menstrual cycle is the lowering of the percent body fat. When women have such a low percent body fat, then they start to lose their menstrual cycle for obvious reasons, because women need a certain percentage of body fat in order to conceive and carry a child. And so the body has its way of preventing pregnancy from occurring if the body fat percentage gets too low. And so it's quite fascinating that the human body is smart enough that it can do that. And so the losing of the menstrual cycle seems to have more to do with the lack of calories coming in to offset the enormous amount of calories that are being burned through running. So that takes care of the intrinsic factor of sex. I just want to make that clear, that women are at no greater risk of injuries compared to males if they don't have any of the characteristics of the female athlete triad. Running history is another intrinsic factor. Like I said before, if you're a new runner, then you have a greater risk of injury. A previous injury puts you at greater risk. So even if you've been running for a long time, if you've already had 3 stress fractures, well, guess what? You're at a greater risk of getting another one, because it shows that that body part, in this case a bone, is vulnerable. And so if you've had Achilles tendonitis before, you have a greater risk of getting Achilles tendonitis again, because it shows that that Achilles tendon is vulnerable. And so previous injury is a significant risk factor for future running injuries. And so you can think of anything that's intrinsic to you. Age is another big factor. Older people take longer to recover in between workouts, and so they have more susceptible to running injuries compared to when they were younger. Even myself, when I look back on the kind of training I did when I was younger, you could do hard workouts and races much more often than I can now at my age. And so all of those things are intrinsic factors, factors specific to you, that can increase the risk of running-related injury. And then there are extrinsic factors, factors specific to your environment. And so those are mostly training factors, the volume of training, how many miles you're running per week, and the intensity of training. How often are you doing hard workouts? How fast are those workouts? Certain kinds of workouts put more stress on certain body parts than others. Like very fast speed work or plyometrics, that puts a lot of stress on the Achilles tendon. So if you have a vulnerable Achilles tendon and you do that high intensity work, you do like sprinting and plyometric activities, then those put more stress on the Achilles tendon, and that can make a risk for an injury. So you got to look at your training as far as the extrinsic factors. Shoes can also be another extrinsic factor, but shoes in general really don't cause injury. If you have the wrong shoe, then that could potentially cause injury, because it's making your foot do something that it's not supposed to do when it lands on the ground. And so say you need a stability shoe, but you're running in a cushioning shoe, a neutral shoe. Well, then that could potentially cause an injury, because you've got the wrong shoe for your needs for your running mechanics. So as long as you have the right type of shoes for your running mechanics, then the shoes themselves don't cause an injury. So don't ever blame your shoes if you get injured. However, getting injured is always a good sign that it's good to change your shoes, because most people will wear their shoes for too long. Most shoes are not designed to last a year. They last only about 300 to 500 miles on average, but it depends on a lot of factors. It depends on where you're running and the surfaces you're running on. If you're always running on rugged trails, then the shoes aren't going to last as long as if you're running on smooth pavement. Or if you're a heavier runner and you're producing a lot of force against the ground every time you run, then you're going to wear down the shoes earlier than somebody who's lighter on their feet. And it also depends on how quickly you accumulate the mileage on the shoes and the weather conditions that you're running in. So there's a lot of factors that will dictate how long a pair of running shoes can last. But on average, about 300 to 500 miles, and again, depends on your body weight and things like that. But shoes are never really the reason why somebody gets injured. So never blame your shoes. And so those are kind of the extrinsic factors. And so we can look at, well, what are the intrinsic factors? So if you get injured, you look at, well, what are the intrinsic factors that may have caused this injury? What are the extrinsic factors that may have caused this injury? A lot of the intrinsic factors you can't control. You can't control your age. You can't control male or female. You can't control, sometimes you can control, but if you've already had a previous injury, well, that's said and done already. That's in the past. You can't control that happened then. All you can do is control the future. And so a lot of the intrinsic factors you can't control. But the extrinsic factors, of course, we can control. We can control, how much mileage or how quickly we ramp up the mileage. We can control the intensity of the training that we do. We can control the time in between harder workouts. There's a lot that we can control. And so before I get to some of my training secrets of what to do to prevent injury, let me see if there's any quick questions here, because I see some questions here. Gwyneth says, most high school female athletes who are undernourished. Yeah, right. And that's why you see these stress fractures so much at the high school and college level, because they are undernourished. And that's really the trigger. It's not so much the amount of running that they're doing that's triggering the loss of the menstrual cycle. The research is pretty clear on this. And I know a lot about this. And I wrote a whole book, Running for Women. This is a subject that is very close to my interest. I'm fascinated by women's physiology and how women can exploit their unique physiology and train smarter, and what happens when you lose the menstrual cycle. I find that all very fascinating, actually. And so the trigger to the loss of the menstrual cycle and then the slippery slope of the stress fractures, that has to do with that. You're right, Gwenna, that they're malnourished. They're not getting in, because there's this thing that women think, and I don't want to spend too much time on it. We can have a whole other show just on women's training, which I probably will do. But women think that the lighter they are, then the faster they're going to run. And to a degree, that's true. You look at the best female runners, they're very lightweight. But there's a fine line there. You have to make sure that you stay on the safe side of that line and still get in all the macro and micronutrients, all the vitamins, the minerals that you need to be able to be healthy. Because it all starts from a place of health. You can't do the training and the racing at that level if you're not healthy. And so even though you can still run with a loss of the menstrual cycle, you still have to make sure that you're nourishing yourself and getting in all the nutrients that you need, so that your training and your racing doesn't suffer because of it, and you don't put yourself in a situation where you can get a stress fracture from the low estrogen. So good question. And Gwen said, yeah, they're super body conscious. Yeah, exactly, especially teenage girls. Yeah, it's tough. I mean, especially now with social media, they have the easy comparison to other people. I mean, I don't have any kids, but I don't know how parents raise kids in these days with social media, especially raising girls. I mean, I just think it would be so difficult, because you just have that ability to compare to others right there in your face every single day. I can't even imagine what it would be like to raise girls in this day and age with social media. It must be so difficult, so stressful for both the kids and the parents. I give them credit. I don't know that I could do that. It would be so hard. But anyway, I don't want to digress too much. So let's talk about how to prevent running injuries, because it's not it is what you think, and it's also not what you think. Because I see a lot these days on social media and the things that people post, the articles you see online, there's a lot on things like strength training. I talked about strength training in the last episode. There's a lot of stuff on strength training and massage and myofascial release and the foam rollers and the cryotherapy and the cold water baths and the compression socks, and there's all these things that people like to throw at themselves. Oh, try this or try that. You got to cross train. You got to foam roll. You got to do this. You got to do that. Blah 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 blah. You know what? None of that baloney works. When you ask yourself, what is the cause of the running injury? Why am I getting injured? Is it because I didn't foam roll for 15 minutes yesterday? No. It's because running injuries occur because you are applying a low level of stress repeatedly over and over and over again. There's two major ways you can get injured. From big trauma, big stress one time, like a football player gets tackled, or you fall off a bicycle, or you fall when you're running. You can break your hip, or you can break a bone, or you can, severely injure yourself from huge trauma, one shot, big trauma. That's one way. That's not the way runners usually get injured, unless you fall down while you're running, which is possible. One time I was chased by a dog, and the dog come running at me, and it shocked me, and I tripped over my own feet, and I fell onto the asphalt. I was running in the middle of the street, and I bruised my hip. Luckily, I didn't do any major damage, but the hip was bothering me for about a week. I bruised my hip, and then it was hard to run with the bruised hip. And then one time I fell in the rain, and I hurt my ribs. Have you ever tried to run with bruised ribs? Oh my God, that hurts so much. I mean, just to take a breath hurts. So there have been a few times in my life where I have fallen on the ground. And so you can get injured from that huge trauma. But for the most part, runners get injured because you are applying a small amount of stress over and over and over again with every single foot strike onto the ground. And so you have to ask yourself, well, how do I prevent that kind of stress from causing some kind of an injury? Can I wear compression socks? Is that going to do anything? Do I foam roll? Is that going to do anything? Do I go into a cold water bath for recovery? Is that going to do anything? Do I go get a massage? Do I do acupuncture and all those methods, all these things? No, none of that stuff is going to alleviate this small amount of micro trauma we get every single time we land on the ground. And it's through that repeated action, there's a very ballistic, eccentric component to running. And that's why Achilles tendonitis is so common. Because imagine what the Achilles tendon has to do, every time you land on the ground and you store potential energy, and then that is given to you back. The Achilles tendon is like a little spring that stores energy, and then it gives it back on every single step. And you do that thousands and thousands and thousands of times just on a single run. One 5-mile run could be about 5,000 steps. You run a marathon, that's probably over 26,000 steps. If you take about 1,000 steps per mile, give or take. So it's repeated small micro trauma over and over and over again. And so what is going to prevent that micro trauma, that repeated micro trauma, from causing injury? Well, that gets into the extrinsic factors, your training. Okay, so let's talk about the training, because the research is pretty clear. Myofascial release, whether it's done by a massage therapist or a self-massage and a foam roller, and all the other gimmicks and gadgets, that stuff does not prevent running injuries because it doesn't get at the cause of those running injuries. Like I said before, if you're a female and you have low bone density because you're losing your menstrual cycle, you're setting yourself up for a stress fracture. No amount of foam rolling is going to prevent that stress fracture. The same thing with Achilles tendonitis or plantar fasciitis or any other kind of itis that runners get. No amount of foam rolling or anything like that is going to prevent those kinds of injuries that runners get. Runners mostly get joint injuries. And the myofascial release gets more to the fascia, the covering of the muscle itself. It doesn't even really get about the muscle. It's really more about the fascia that surrounds the muscle. And so really that doesn't have anything to do with running-related injuries, which are mostly joint in nature for runners. Maybe other kinds of injuries in other sports, they get more muscular kinds of injuries. But most of the injuries in running are bone or joint related. And so it's affecting, the muscle tendon junction. And so other, all these modalities that you hear about, and also the strength training as well. Strength training has been shown, if you do very heavy strength training, it's been shown to improve bone mineral density, but only by 1 to 2%. And so you ask yourself, well, that may be statistically significant in scientific research. Is that practically significant? If you increase your bone density by 1 to 2% from heavy strength training, is that 1 to 2% greater bone density enough to prevent a stress fracture when you run? That's hard to say. I mean, it depends on the conditions. Probably not. And so all these other factors, and by the way, strength training, even though that gets a lot of attention, the research is pretty clear that strength training does not prevent running-related injuries because it's not getting at the precise cause of what's causing a running-related injury. It's really mostly training factors. And so I have a number of secrets. I call them secrets, but some of them are obvious, some of them are not so obvious. But I have a number of secrets that can prevent runners from getting injured. So one of those secrets, we'll start with the biggest one, is you have to train smart. Most people, it amazes me that most people still do not train with intelligence, even though there is a ton of information online, in books, and if I were you, I would read the books that are written by people with credibility. Don't just read Runner's World magazine and anything else you find online. The first thing I would always do, and this isn't a side note, but the first thing I would always do, if you read something online, whether it's on Facebook or Instagram, or you see it on runnersworld.com or whatever, first thing you do, look at the person who wrote the piece. Look at the article, look at the book, look at the person who wrote the article or book, or posted the thing on social media, and ask yourself what their credentials are. And I remember, I've said this before, I've said it a million times, you wouldn't take legal advice from someone who didn't go to law school. You wouldn't take medical or health advice from someone who didn't go to school for that. You wouldn't take physical therapy advice from someone who didn't go to school for physical therapy. So don't take your running injury advice or running training advice from someone who doesn't have a solid background in that. It just doesn't make sense. You wouldn't do that for other professional services. Don't do it for this one. And so that can take care of a lot of the crap that we see on social media and in articles online, is that the people writing these articles don't have the training for it. They don't have the expertise. And so that's why they say things like foam roll to prevent running injuries or strength train to prevent running injuries. That's why they say things like that, because they don't really, really know. And so the research doesn't show that strength training really prevents the kinds of injuries that runners get. Because like I said before, most of the kinds of injuries that runners get are joint related, not muscle related. And if you're going to strength train, it has to be very high intensity. Just doing 10 or 20 reps of easy exercises with dumbbells or machines, or doing body weight exercises, that kind of stuff is not intense enough to make the muscle and the tendons strong enough and more resilient enough to prevent the kinds of injuries that runners get. You're not going to prevent a stress fracture or Achilles tendonitis because you do body weight squats. It's just not going to carry over to the micro trauma that you get repeatedly when you run. And so what are some of the training secrets? Well, the first one is train smart. And so what does that mean? Well, it means a lot of things. It means, number one, only increasing the volume and intensity in a very systematic, slow way. So say you're running 20 miles a week right now. Very good. Don't go from 20 a week to 25, from 25 to 30, from 30 to 35. Don't ramp up the volume week after week after week. This is a big mistake that marathon training programs make across the country and around the world, is that they take people from practically nothing from their couch to the marathon in 6 months. And so if you look at how many weeks you have, you count the number of weeks, every week they're going to have to increase the length of the long run, the total volume of running that they do, and that's the kind of thing that leads to injury. You have to give your body time to adapt. There's a whole body of research on adaptation. I talk about this all the time. It's in my certification course manuals. It's in my books. I'm working on another book right now on training theories for runners, and I'm talking all about it right now. So that book will come out next year. I urge you to get that. But I urge you to go and look at the research. Start with the biggest player in this field, Hans Selye, and his general adaptation syndrome. Look at how we respond to stressors. A lot of the training that runners do, it all goes back to Hans Selye and the general adaptation syndrome, where we apply a stress and our body reacts and recovers to that stress and reestablishes homeostasis. And when you increase the training stress, when you introduce stressors before the body has made those adaptations and has recovered from the stress that you gave it, that's when injuries occur. Because you're applying another stress when your body is still what Hans Selye called the alarm stage. When you introduce a stressor, your body goes through this alarm stage, and then it goes through a regeneration or recovery stage. You have to wait after you apply a new stressor, which in the case of a runner can be the weekly volume. We can look at it by a day. We can look at stressors on each day, like a workout, or you can look at the stressor in a more macro environment, like a week or a month of training. And so when you apply this certain stressor, when you do a volume of running that you're not used to doing before, you must allow your body to adjust to that and adapt to that before you increase that stress, before you give more of the stress. Because if you don't, that's what's going to lead to an injury. And so training smart means understanding the training process and how important recovery is, and getting away from that alarm stage that Hans Selye talked about, and allowing your body to make the necessary adaptations, whether those are physiological adaptations or structural adaptations, like the bone or a tendon becoming more resilient and stronger. You have to allow the body to adapt to the stress before you increase the stress. So that's one part of training smart, is very slowly and systematically increase the stress from week to week and month to month and even year to year. And when you do that, you will avoid injury. The other part of training smart is understanding what the purpose of each workout is and running only as fast as you need to meet the purpose of the workout. So say you're doing an interval workout. Let's just use some easy example. Say you're doing a VO2 max interval workout and you're doing 3-minute reps. Say you're doing half-mile reps on the track. And say your VO2 max pace is 6 minutes. I'm just going to make the math easy. If your VO2 max pace is 6 minutes per mile and you do half-mile reps in 3 minutes each, if that's enough to reach your VO2 max, then why run the half-mile repeats in 2:55 or 2:52? You don't need to run that fast to meet the purpose of the workout. You only need to run them in 3 minutes each to reach your VO2 max and to train the VO2 max. Same thing with lactate threshold or whatever it is. Even if it's strength in a gym, you only need to work out at the lowest intensity possible to meet the purpose of the workout. Not the highest intensity possible, because that's only adding more stress, causing more alarm. It's going to take longer to adapt, and it's no extra benefit to that. You only need to run as slow as possible to meet the benefits of the workout. And then to fatigue yourself, you just do more reps, or you take less recovery time in between each rep. There's many ways to design an interval workout to cause it to be more stressful rather than to run faster. There's 3 other ways. You can manipulate the volume of work either by lengthening the duration. So instead of 3-minute reps, you can go 3 minutes and 20 seconds or 3.5-minute reps. Or you can reduce the time of the recovery interval, or you do more reps. And so, don't run faster if you don't need to run faster to meet the purpose of the workout. So that gets us to the other part of the, how to run intelligently, how to train smart. Very slowly and systematically increase the volume over time. And the same thing with the intensity, very slowly and systematic. So when you introduce a new kind of a workout, maybe just do the workout once a week. And then once you're used to doing the workout once a week, then maybe alternate. Maybe 1 week you do 2 workouts, and the following week you go back to 1, and then the next week you do 2, and then the following week you do 1. And when you adapt to that, then you can add the second workout every week. And then now every week you're doing 2 workouts. So you have to do it systematically. I use that word a lot in my speaking, in my writing, systematically. Everything conforms to a system that is intelligent. You apply a little bit of stress, you adapt and respond to that stress, and what you end up doing is you supercompensate or overcompensate to that stress because the way you can think of training is that you're always applying some kind of threat on some aspect of your body's survival. And what your body does is it adapts to that threat by adapting more than what it normally would have. And so you overcompensate to that threat so that the same threat later in the future doesn't cause the same degree of physiological disruption. It doesn't disrupt your body as much as it did the first time that you encountered your threat. How smart is your body? It's like these smart cars that you see, or the smartphones, or the smart watches. Your body is the smartest piece of equipment that you have. Think about that for a second. You apply a stress and a series of stresses over time, and your body overcompensates to that stress so that when you re-encounter that same stress again in the future, it doesn't cause the same degree of physiological disruption inside your body. Oh my God, how cool is that? That's very cool, Jason. I'm glad you think so. It's great to have this studio audience. I'm glad you think so. Isn't that incredibly intelligent of your body to do that? So we overcompensate. But in order to do that in the correct way, you have to train with a smart system. You can't just throw all these things at your body, all these stimuli, and expect your body to be able to handle that all at once. You can only handle so much stress at once. Going back to Hans Selye and his general adaptation syndrome, he actually had a word for if your body does not compensate to the stress, that if the stressor is too severe, he called that exhaustion. And you go in this downward spiral, and then eventually, in his terminology, eventually death. And that's how we eventually all die, is that our body can't handle the severe stress that our body is under. And so eventually that exhaustion phase of the general adaptation syndrome leads to death. And so, runners don't have to necessarily deal with such extreme cases. We're not running ourselves to death, thank God. But you still have to give yourself enough time in between these stressors to be able to respond and adapt and overcompensate to that stress. So that's the training smart aspect. Be slow and systematic with how you increase the stress. Run, to use the example I used before, if you're running 20 miles a week, run 20 miles a week, enough weeks in a row that it becomes a normal thing for your body to handle. You'll habituate to that stress, and it's no longer a stress. And then and only then you increase the stress, and then you go to 25 miles a week, and then run 25 miles a week enough times before that's no longer a stress. And then and only then you go to 30 miles a week. And that's the way you train smart. You repeat the stress enough times for your body to recognize it enough times that it's no longer stressful. It becomes a normal thing that your body lives with. And that's how you train slowly and systematically. And then only running as fast as you need to meet the purpose of the workout. And so what's another secret? Another secret is the same thing with the long run. Don't increase the long run. If you're training for a marathon or any other race that you do a long run every week, runners love their long runs, the same thing. Don't increase the length of the long run too quickly. Don't increase it by a mile every single week. Run 10 miles enough times for 10 miles to be a normal stress. And then and only then you increase it to 11 miles. And then run 11 miles enough times for it to be normal. And then and only then increase it to 12 miles. And that's how you increase the duration of the long run. The other issue with the long run is not to make the long run so long compared to all the other runs you do during the week. So say you're training for a marathon and your long run is 15 miles. And all the other runs during the week, the longest is 6. If your longest run is 6 miles during the week and now you're running 15 on the weekend, you don't have to be an Einstein to figure out that that's a lot of stress in one run per week. You don't want the long run to be so much longer than everything else you're doing. You want it to be longer to serve the purpose of a longer duration run and all the benefits that come from that. But you don't want it to be 3 times as long as any other run that you're doing during the week, because that's a recipe for disaster. Because now once a week, you're putting your body under a severe amount of stress that it's not used to doing. You have to have enough mileage during the week to support the long run on the weekend. Everything's got to increase in concert. So if the long run keeps getting longer and longer and longer, then the weekly volume has to get higher and higher and higher to support that long run on the weekend. And that's a big mistake that a lot of runners make, especially when they do these marathon training groups, is that the long run keeps getting longer and longer and longer to get closer and closer to the marathon, but the weekly volume doesn't increase in proportion. The weekly volume must increase in proportion to support the long run on the weekend. And remember, running in and of itself has a prophylactic effect on future injuries, because the more you run, the more resilient the tendons become, the more resilient the bones become, the more resilient all the structures, the ligaments, everything becomes to prevent future injuries. So running in and of itself has a protective effect on future injuries, and that's why beginner runners are at a greater risk of injury than runners who have a lot of running on their legs already. I do want to get to some of the questions, so before I keep going on, let me just see. Sarah asks, what shoes are the best all around for outside pavement? Well, there's no best kind of running shoe. So good question, Sarah. I get asked this question a lot. There is no best kind of running shoe. There are some shoes that are made more for trails. You look at the tread on the bottom of the shoe. It's more rugged on the bottom of the shoe because of the trails. And so shoes to run on the road tend to be more smooth on the bottom. That's fine. I mean, you can even use a trail shoe on the road. It may not feel as comfortable, but you can do that. But there is no specific kind of running shoe that is best. It all comes down to your running mechanics and what you need as a runner, and then what feels most comfortable. Believe it or not, the research shows that comfort is the most significant factor in choice of running shoe. And some of that research comes from one of the schools I attended, University of Calgary, which is extremely well known for biomechanics. They're the top in the world for biomechanics and for exercise science in general. And so there's a lot of great research that comes out of University of Calgary. I'm very proud of the middle diploma up there. I'm very proud of having gone to University of Calgary. Fantastic. Right now, I think their sports science program is ranked #1 in North America and #7 in the world. I mean, they're fantastic. If you ever get the chance to go to Calgary, go visit the Human Performance Laboratory at the University of Calgary. You'll be so impressed when you walk in this place. It's beautiful. And anyway, I can go on and on and on about the University of Calgary. Fantastic exercise science program. And so the research shows that comfort is the most significant factor in choice of running shoe, because you're not going to wear a shoe that's not comfortable. What runner wants that? So good question, Sarah. Thank you for the question. That there's no best running shoe. It all comes down to what you need, and then comfort. Let's see if there's any other questions before I get to Christopher. Could you touch on the merits or otherwise of post-running stretching, please? Okay, so yeah, stretching, I didn't throw that in there, so that's good. I'm glad you brought that up. I forgot. Yeah, so when you don't have a teleprompter, you're doing this all off the cuff. So thank you, Christopher, because sometimes I forget to say things I want to say. So when I was talking about before about like the foam rollers and the compression socks and the cold water therapy and all these other modalities, I can also put stretching into those modalities, into that category. The research does not show that stretching prevents running-related injuries. The really only good thing that stretching is for, and its main reason for being, is to improve range of motion around a joint, and that's the definition of flexibility. Runners in general only really need to be flexible in two places: their hips, so that they can get full hip extension and increase their stride length, and at the ankle for dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, dorsiflexion, because it's that plantar flexion against the ground. I mean, that's the last movement that you make to push off the ground. So it helps to be flexible in the ankles as well as in the hips. But all the things we learned about in high school, where the gym teacher told us to reach down and touch our toes, and we would hold that and cross our legs over and do the same thing. Remember all that? That doesn't prevent any injuries. So whether you do it before or after, research shows that for the purposes of flexibility and to train, to stretch for the purpose of training, then post-workout is better. To do it after or even at some other time later in the day, to do it as its own flexibility training, apart from the running, that's the best. But to prevent injuries, stretching does not prevent running-related injuries. And again, it all goes back to what we talked about before. When you ask yourself, well, what's the reason why runners are getting injured? Then it becomes obvious why stretching is not going to prevent running injuries. The purpose of stretching is to improve range of motion at a joint. The reason why runners get injured has nothing to do with lack of flexibility. It has to do with that micro trauma that you get thousands of times, that low level of trauma thousands of times on every given run. Or it could be even slightly greater trauma if you're doing like a sprint workout or plyometrics, which is much more intense. It's still a low level of trauma that you repeat many times, but it's more aggressive than just easy distance running. But stretching is not going to prevent you from getting Achilles tendonitis. It's not going to prevent you from getting knee pain. It's not going to prevent you from getting a stress fracture, because the reasons why those things occur has nothing to do with lack of stretching. And so always ask yourself, what's the cause of the running injury? And always treat the cause. Don't treat the symptoms. I didn't say that earlier. If you get injured, never treat the symptoms. The symptoms, that's like just putting a Band-Aid on something, but you're not treating the reason why you got the cut in the first place. You have to treat the cause of the running injury, not so much the symptom. You can try to do all these modalities to alleviate the symptoms, but then when you're healthy again and you go back to doing the same running you were doing before, if you don't address the cause, you're going to get re-injured again. And so you have to treat the cause. You have to address the underlying cause. What's the root cause of why I got injured? And the main reason is, what I'm talking right now about the training, the main reason why runners get injured is because they don't train with intelligence. They don't take a very slow, systematic approach in how they train. Every workout has a purpose. You must understand the purpose, and then you match the pace to the purpose of the workout. And so you don't run faster than what you need to meet the purpose of the workout, and you don't increase the volume and intensity or the volume of intensity too quickly for your body to adapt. So let's get to some more of these training secrets. We talked about the training smart and the systematic increase in volume and intensity. We talked about the pace and only running as fast as you need to meet the purpose. The duration of the long run. If you do a long run, then don't increase the duration of the long run too quickly, and have enough volume during the week to support the long run on the weekend. Another issue is, like running with other people. If it's fine to run with other people, but only if they are at the same part of their training program as you, or if they are doing the same kinds of workouts at the same paces that you are. It's great to run with other people, but if you always run with somebody who's much faster than you, who's going much farther than you might be able to get away with that once or twice. But if you do that week after week after week, and they're dragging you along and you're huffing and puffing to keep up with them, then you're just adding more and more stress. And so that can get you a running injury. That can result in a running injury. And so don't always run with other people unless they are matched to your level of fitness and to your part of the training program. Otherwise, you're going to get run into the ground, and that can cause you to get injured. So what else can we talk about as far as running injuries and the stress? It's all about how you apply the stress in a systematic way. As far as the strength training, I talked last time about strength training. There is one condition as far as injuries that I would say that you could strength train, is that if you have some documented strength deficiency, like if your hamstrings are much, much weaker than your quadriceps, there should be about a 2 to 3 ratio. Your quadriceps should be about 3 times as strong as twice your hamstrings. So your quadriceps are stronger than your hamstrings, but they shouldn't be 3 times as strong as your hamstrings. There should be like a 3 to 2 ratio. So you should be able to lift 2/3 the amount of weight with your hamstrings as your quadriceps. And that's true for other pairings of muscle groups. And so if your hamstrings are much weaker than your quadriceps, so that if you go and run a lot, you're going to have some kind of hamstring injury, well then you might need to do some isolated strength training for that weak body part. But always try, like I said in the last episode, always try to do the strength training as close as possible to the running movements and to the running conditions. Doing certain workouts in a gym that have nothing to do with the way those muscles are used when you run, well, that's not going to help. You'll have to try to use those muscles in the gym, try to mimic the movements as best as possible, so that you're not just training muscle, but you're training movement, and specifically the movement of running, so that you don't get injured while you're running. And so that's very important. And so I will say that there are some conditions in which you may have to do some isolated strength training if you have some documented strength deficiency, if you are very weak in a certain place. But try to mimic the movement of running with that strength training as much as possible, so that you are training the way the muscles are producing force while you run, rather than doing some movement that has nothing to do with that, because then you're not training the muscles in the right way. So that's very important to always keep that in mind. Let's get to some other questions. Could you touch on the merits or other? Oh, the stretching. We already talked about that. Let's see if there are any other questions around here. Now, feel free to ask questions. If I can't get to them, if I can't see them when I'm scrolling, if I can't get to them, then I will address them in the comments after the video is saved and posted. But all the secrets about preventing running injuries really comes down to how you design the training program and being slow and systematic with how you present the stress. Older runners, that's another training strategy, that with older runners, you have to take more time in between harder workouts than with younger runners. And so, younger runners can do harder workouts more often. And so again, if you're older, you have to plan the training more intelligently. Younger runners can get away with training mistakes. Older runners cannot. And so you have to be even more careful when you're older and how you apply the stress and giving yourself enough recovery time. There's a lot of talk about overtraining. You hear that word a lot. I have never been a fan of that word. I believe, I know that it is more a factor of under-recovery. Overtraining should be called under-recovery, because human beings have proven that they could handle an enormous amount of training. I mean, you look at what Ironman triathletes have to do, both in training and in the race itself. Human beings are capable of enormous workload. It's the lack of recovery that causes the injuries. And so the term overtraining really should be coined under-recovery. And that's more than just semantics, because it changes your perspective. It changes the way you look at it. If you look at it as overtraining, the focus is on the training, and you think, oh, I need to back off on the training. The training is not the problem in most cases. It's the lack of recovery. It's the under-recovery. And so by referring to it as under-recovery, that changes your perspective and then changes how you address the issue. Now you start to factor in more recovery rather than address an issue related to the training. So it's a whole different mind shift in how you approach the training aspect by focusing on the recovery. So what else? Again, I don't have a teleprompter here. I'm not reading anything. I'm just thinking off the top of my head. And again, a lot of the modalities to use that you hear about, I'll keep coming back to this because I don't know when people jump in. And again, this will be recorded. But when people think of preventing running injuries, their mind automatically goes to the things that don't matter, like the foam rollers. I keep picking on the foam rollers. The foam rollers, the stretching, the cold water baths, the compression socks. All this stuff has minimal to no effect on prevention of running injuries. It really has more to do with how people are training and increasing the volume too quickly, increasing the length of the long run, introducing intensity too quickly. Oh, that reminds me. See, now I know, because again, I don't tell if I say something, and it reminds me of something else. The volume and intensity combination never increase the volume and intensity at the same time. So as you're increasing the volume of work that you do, that if you go from 30 miles a week to 35 or 35 to 40, or if you're already running high mileage, if you're going from 60 to 70 or something like that, don't increase the intensity of training at the same time that you increase the volume. Only increase one of those two variables at the same time. So if you're increasing the volume, just stick with the volume increase. And when it's time to increase the intensity, like if you're putting in a second hard workout that week, or even when you go from just doing no intensity to putting in one hard workout per week, either keep the volume where it is, so either keep the weekly mileage at the same point, or even decrease it a little bit to accommodate the increase in intensity. But don't ever increase the volume and the intensity at the same time, because that's a recipe. Unless you're very talented, a lot of talented people and younger people can get away with that. But unless you're very talented and your body is able to, and when I say talent, I also mean the ability for the body to adapt. That's also genetically related. Some people have a great propensity for adaptation and others not so much. And that's why Olympians can run over 100 miles a week and they don't get injured, because they have a huge ability to adapt to that amount of stress and recover from it. And so don't increase the volume and intensity, at the same time. That either make sure that the volume stays where it is when you add more intensity, or even reduce the volume slightly to accommodate the greater intensity. But try to stay away from increasing the weekly mileage at the same time you're putting in faster workouts into your schedule. That's a huge red flag when people do that, when they increase the volume and intensity at the same time. That's a big thing that can cause to get injured. So stay away from that. So there's lots of little tricks like this with the planning of the training. It requires some thought, and that's always why it's beneficial to have a coach do this stuff for you, rather than you sit and try to plan it all yourself and relieve yourself from the stress of all that thought that has to go into the planning of this. It has to be written intelligently, always keeping in mind the risk for injury as you increase the volume and the intensity more and more and more. You have to be careful with how you apply the stress. So there's a bunch of secrets of how to prevent running-related injury. If you follow all those secrets, you're not likely to get injured. And again, going back to the shoes, making sure you have the right shoes for your foot type and your running mechanics, that's an easy fix. Running shoe stores can help you decide on what kind of running shoe you need. And so if you monitor all these factors and plan your training in a very smart, systematic way, look for when the races, we don't know when races are going to be right now, but when they get back on the schedule, from the time of the race, plan the training backwards, and so you can have time to plan it out so you don't run out of time. Plan the race backwards from the date of the race and figure out how much time do I need to spend in this phase of training, how much time do I need to spend in that phase of training, and plan the training out in that way, in a very smart, systematic way. Always plan it out from backwards from when the race is, so you don't run out of time. And speaking of time, I know that at least Instagram, I don't know about Facebook, but at least Instagram cuts you off at an hour. And so I don't want to run over an hour here. I do want to get to some more questions. So if you have any more questions, be sure to type them in, and I will get to them. And every time, at the end of every show, I like to leave with a thought. And this one is kind of difficult to address because I found out over the weekend I got a very disturbing phone call from somebody who I didn't know, but she called me about her aunt. And her aunt was a friend and was my next door neighbor when I lived in Bloomington, Indiana, while I was working on my PhD. I was living in this old apartment building, and literally right next door, inches away from my door, was her door. And I found out that last Wednesday, she committed suicide. And it was shocking. It was weird. I actually had just talked to her on the phone a week ago, and I found out about this on Saturday, the day before yesterday. Her niece called me from Indiana and told me what had happened. And so my thought today is, during this time that we're going through right now, I know it's difficult for people, and I know humans have this desperate need to socialize and be with other people. But, there is always help. There is always somebody you can reach out to for help. And use your running. So, running is the best therapist. I have known that ever since I was a kid. And, I'm lucky that my head is screwed on pretty straight for the most part. And I don't have those kinds of depression tendencies. But I know that others do. And I also know the power of exercise and the power of running specifically, and how it literally changes your brain chemistry. It increases serotonin, it increases the release of opioids and cannabinoids, which are responsible for the runner's high. And most people think it's endorphins, but it's not endorphins, because those don't pass through the blood-brain barrier. But the opioids and cannabinoids do. And that is what's responsible for the runner's high. And so use this time to run and to get a lot out of your running. If you don't run for the sake of training and the sake of getting faster, then use your running as a therapist. Talk to yourself on your run. Go outside someplace where it's beautiful, go out in nature, and use running as your therapist, and use it as your strength, so that you don't get so depressed that you go to the dark side like my friend did. And I don't want to get any more phone calls from people's relatives to hear that somebody has taken their own life. Nobody should have to feel so hopeless that they do that. And so use your running to gain strength. Running could be the best therapist. And like I've said many times, and I write in my books that, running gives you clarity, and it literally helps you put space between yourself and your problems, enabling you to insert clarity in that space. And so use your running for those reasons. Literally put space between yourself and your problems through the act of running. You leave the front door of your house, you put space between yourself and your problems, and you work on inserting clarity in that space. Thank you for joining us. Come back next week for another episode of Run Talk. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Karp. Have a great week.